Afternoon, everyone, and thanks for affording us this opportunity to discuss and to look at this very, very important matter, the matter of student accommodation. And my name is Letumile Sebolai, as it is said, and I'm the founder and the CEO of NPS Management Solution, company that was started just after the norms and standards were launched. So the whole purpose was to try and assist universities and the landlords in terms of implementing the norms and standards. And we have worked with a couple of universities since then. And where we are today, we are appointed by NSFAS to be one of the service providers who are working on the accreditation. You have heard Honorable Letsia earlier on talking about the changes. So we have been very much involved in those changes, including the accreditation model that you're going to be seeing coming through very soon. We are fully behind that. We are quite involved in that and the whole grading system. So the team that is with me here in the panel are all the people who are quite involved in this space of student accommodation. Then I will allow you time to just briefly introduce yourself briefly, and then we can go around. Then we'll hit in terms of getting to our questions for this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Stanley. My name is Bafuze Yabo. I'm a member of Parliament, the 6th Parliament. I'm a member of the Portfolio Committee on Higher Education, Science and Innovation. In actual fact, I'm a member in 3 portfolio committees, but what brings me here is Higher Education, Science and Innovation. I've been dubbed as from the department. I am not from the department. We hold the department, and it's 100+ entities, which include universities, TVET colleges, NSFAS, and everyone else in the sector to account. So when they have to account, they come to us. My colleague was the one presenting here, Honorable Galetti. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good evening. I'm Dean Wiid from Galetti Corporate Real Estate. I'm part of the Corporate Services Division. We deal with occupied spaces, particularly in the commercial industrial sector. On top of that, we deal with a lot of capital markets disposals and acquisitions for listed funds and banks, which is how we've got involved in the student accommodation space. Essentially, we assist investors in buying and trading those assets.
Okay, welcome, Dean. Let's move on to the next person.
Johan Janse van Vuuren from Eris Property Group. You also might be familiar with 2 of the other brands that we've got in the market. South African Student Accommodation Impact Investments, which is the funding vehicle that we're rolling out, hopefully between 10 and 15,000 beds into the market in the next few years. And 75% of those beds are aimed at the NSFAS market as well, so aiming at the lower end. And then our other brand is Rise Student Living, which is our property management brand that takes care of student accommodation management. And then Eris Property Group is the developer and investment and fund manager for those funds.
Okay, thanks, Johan. I think the next one, she has already introduced herself, so let me not even waste your time. But if you want to say something, I can allow you time to say a bit more. Introduction.
I think the only thing I can add maybe is that, you know, we play in that gap that I was talking about, and we do manage student accommodation in that for the smaller players, and we have our own portfolio that we manage as well.
Okay, last but not least, again, you have already introduced yourself. Do you want to add something, or you're fine?
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah, good, thank you. Okay, thank you, colleagues. I think the first point to look at is what is really governing this whole thing of student accommodation. And I guess we all know about the minimum norms and standards that we have been talking about since this whole day. So now I want to take the question to Honorable Yabo. Can we talk about these norms and standards? We know that the first policy came in 2015 and it was meant to run for 5 years. and there was some review going on for the new one. How far are we with that one? I know it's not your department, you are overseeing that, but do you know anything? How far is the department, and what can we expect?
Well, I think, here I went with the typical politician speak well. It's part of the tools of trade.
Yeah.
The specifications around the amendments or the review of the minimum norms and standards are something that we'll still get from the department because they've done the public participation leg of it.
Yeah.
And the intention of updating policy or lawmaking in engaging the stakeholders who are affected by the policy or the law is enshrined in our constitution. So you have to engage stakeholders or those that are going to be affected by the law. And that process is quite a specific and onerous one, by the way, because it is detailed in the lawmaking process of our country. So once you have received these comments, these interactions, you must then go through them, and you are also going to measure them against what it is that the stakeholders would want to see reviewed and changed in the policy or the law. And so you can't give it over for signature in the case of a policy where the minister has to gazette it without taking consideration of that. So what is now left is that they must issue a report that speaks to what is it that they picked up with the engagements, whether oral or written submissions that they would have gotten from the stakeholders themselves. And once that process is done, only can it be taken through to cabinet for ratification and implementation. And so that's where we are now. We are literally sitting in the gap between the end of the public participation process and the report to be delivered to cabinet for ratification. And we would like to see speedy implementation of that process. And so we try to keep the separation of powers as clean as possible. So we come in as an after the fact authority. Once work has been done, we look at whether it has been done according to what has been presented to us at the start of any year or any cycle of process. And so we will probably get to see the end result of it once it's been ratified by the minister. We will hope that the minister will push, because it will be the difference between NSFAS implementing successfully the centralized accreditation model within the context of the minimum norms and standards of the student housing policy.
Okay. Thank you. Well said there. I think our discussion really today will be centered around what he just said and what was said earlier on by Honorable Letsie. These changes that are coming in to say, how are these changes impacting you in this industry, in this space? And I'll touch on one or two of those things that he didn't mention. Maybe let's rush straight to the issue of centralizing the accreditation, which you just touched now. How are you affected by this? What is your view on this? What do you see in this, what is coming? To say, moving away from university accrediting you and going to a centralized space accrediting you. And maybe I would like to hear from you in terms of what is the view from those that you represent in the PSHA, and maybe I'll also put it the same question. I might throw it back to you, Retha, and to you, Johan. How do you respond and react to this that is coming, the issue of centralization of accreditation?
Thanks, Stanley. Don't know if I'm still audible.
Yes.
I mean, it's definitely welcomed. I think in any process, end-to-end value chain process, you do want to see integration. You do want to see standardization has been thrown loosely, but I think you need quality services at every touch point. And so for me, instead of maybe calling it centralization, I would call it integration.
Right.
So it's definitely welcomed. And why I'm saying integration is because, I think Ndadiliti also and yourself, Ndate, yeah, we pointed out that, the NSFAS is under so much pressure to implement this. But it can't go unsaid that there's institutional knowledge and legacies that are within our universities that are going to either feel displaced or not necessarily be well integrated if we only centralize everything at the apex at NSFAS. I think it's critical that we leverage the institutional knowledge and expertise that is in our universities and fine-tune it in a way that ensures that there's integration and not too many gaps and leaks of services and the standard from end to end. Thanks.
Okay. I'll come back to you later on the same point, because you heard earlier on that said one of the reasons why they are moving away is because from the universities, things are not done that clean and all that. So I want you to start thinking about how will you do it clean this time if you want NSFAS to run, but with integrating the same person they're running away from. So think of it, but we'll come back later on that. Do you want to comment on the changes, just on the issue of centralization, which you want to call it integration, but what's your response on that? What does it do to your business?
So we've already heard from the universities that, great, NSFAS will accredit you, but guess what? You still have to accredit with us, because not everybody can apply on the NSFAS portal. So if you want other students, you have to still be accredited with us. So all of this means to us is a double cost now, because I have to pay them and I'm going to have to pay NSFAS for accreditation. So that's a bit of a, yeah, I don't know how that's going to play out. And of course, with the centralized process, it already changed the norms and standards. We don't know how these new standards came about. We don't know what is supposed to be, how does grading work? How do we get a great grading versus a low grading? All of there's so much uncertainty and unclarity in that process that hasn't been communicated to us that it really feels like we're just rolling with the punches right now.
Okay. A point to note there to Honorable Yabo that there's a lot of uncertainty where we are right now. So, and I think on that question, I will also throw it to Dean to say, what does this uncertainty do to the funders like you and many others who are sitting here who are funding and all that? What does this uncertainty do, and what are you experiencing in your transactions and discussions with the service providers when they come with projects? And that question, I will also, after him, I'll throw it back to the floor. There are those from, I heard from Old Mutual, I heard from NHFC and others. If you are a financier here, you are next, you can raise up your hand to respond after you respond as well.
Thanks, Stanley. Yeah, essentially how this works out is that it pushes up your operational cost. I mean, as Retha was talking about, you have the university who controls essentially the accommodation budget from NSFAS. And this is not with every university, I appreciate. They all have their own operational procedures. But in the ones that do, they dictate a mandate to the student accommodation holders where they say that you can't have top-ups or you can't charge for additional Wi-Fi or water or electricity or anything like that. From a funding perspective, it puts uncertainty in the lender's mind. What is your operational cost? Who knows, who cares? It puts pressure on your yields. You had a fixed yield in mind when you applied for the finance. Now all of a sudden, it's whatever, you're going to tell a student you've got free electricity and free water. Things get out of control. It does, unfortunately, put a lot of risk on the lender as well as the operator, which unfortunately has chased a lot of guys away from this.
Okay. What will we say? Are there hands there from the financiers? I'm picking on the financiers down there to respond to the same point. There's a hand there, I think it's DBSA. What does this do? This transition that NSFAS and DHET is going through, what does it do to you? And what have been your experience? Mainly, let's call it this year, from January to now. What have you been picking up?
It's been, like the panelists have said, it's caused uncertainty. We had certainty until about 3 years ago, and things happened the year, well, from about 3 years ago, there seemed to be certainty in the market. And then when the tender process came out last year, and with what you are doing with them, it's again balls up in the air. In fact, we had clients stopping transactions because they're waiting to see what NSFAS is going to do and how the accreditation is going to happen. So certainly it's slowed down business because of that. What we do welcome, though, as a funder, is that 15-year lease, because that'll bring the cost of borrowing down quite a bit for our clients, because at the moment, with only accreditation, you've got this mismatch between the tenure of the facility as well as the length of time for the accreditation. So that is something to look forward to.
Okay. We'll talk on that point of the 15-year, because there's also an element here of it's about the takeoff. I mean the off-takes, and also these ones that are on a annual year-on-year accreditation. Johan, you want to respond on this point?
On the centralization, there is so much confusion that the uncertainty is creating our investment capital flowing into this industry to have been turned off in March. It was literally a tap that got shut off immediately. And because of that, pipeline rollout for the next few years to cover the gap that Letumile was talking about earlier is now closed. Everybody's sitting back and waiting. What's going to happen? Are they going to sort it out? Aren't they going to sort it out? NSFAS is historically notorious about getting their payments to students on time. Now they want to run the accreditation process, the leasing process, and the payment process. So in theory, and it's an excellent idea. It's like Letumile said, that centralization or integration is excellent. But what's happened now is there's 26 universities, we've got 100 and other institutions, TVETs,
colleges, yes,
to add up to the 100 that Honorable Bafuze was talking about. But let's say out of those 26, 16 were working. 10 was a shambles, we know that. So fix the 10 that weren't working, and once you understand how that works and you've got those fixed, then move to the ones that are working, and then phase it across. But coming in March, after everybody has sort of been accredited, I think the other presenter mentioned there was a presentation done by NSFAS in September last year. Student accommodation, you start leasing in August. So already accreditations had been done by universities. NSFAS, or the rentals, had been agreed where we're going for the next year. In September, a presentation gets done, and in March it says, all right, now we've got a cap. It destroys the comfort and the certainty in the market for the investors that all aim to do the same thing. We want to provide beds at the quality for the NSFAS students in the country.
Okay. Very, very important points there that are coming through. I'll put that back to you, Honorable Yabo, to say, with all these frustrations that you are picking up from the stakeholders, what is it that we can expect probably in the coming few months or to next year? Are we going to see this change eventually coming in, or is it just a discussion? Where are we? What's going on?
Well, I think I want to put this in a diplomatic fashion.
Sure.
The next time we're going to have an engagement with NSFAS, we are going to have to ask these tough questions, as well as the department, because we would have to understand what is going to be the turnaround time to providing policy stability to the sector. To us, the discussion is not about beds, it's about students, it's about humans. And I think this is what the minimum norms and standards attempts to do. It attempts to remove the impersonalization of the sector, to make it, to give it a human touch, that these are humans you are dealing with. And I think I appreciate what Retha said earlier on, that when she interfaced with the students, they were able to say, but it's been 5 months. We've been sleeping without beds, we've been sleeping on the floor, and we are venting out, and these are human beings. And so the discussion around policy certainty, for those who are crunching the numbers, yes, we agree with them. For us, it's a policy certainty to ensure that the human beings who go to these universities or institutions of higher learning are taken care of with proper roofs over their head. And it's not just a numbers game to us. It's a human element that needs to be addressed and addressed properly and quickly. And so the next time we interface with NSFAS, we will ask these hard questions. The next time we interface with the department, we will ask these hard questions. Some of you who have followed our portfolio committee meetings, either on YouTube or on TV, would know how hard we come on these institutions or SOEs or the department itself if they do not meet up to the standards that we have promised as politicians. And so, to be diplomatic, we are not going to be very nice if they are not going to show us progress within the agreed to timelines.
Okay. Thank you. Very, very important point there coming through. Maybe let's move on, but I'm also continuing on what was said from the DBSA. She spoke about certainty and said that because of 15 years, then it's becoming good and all that. But it's not all that everybody's going to get into a 15 year. We know that there's an issue of year on year and all that. What does that do to you if you are not one of those who are fortunate to get to be part of the long-term lease? Because there are all these short terms that you, and I know when you go to the funding, it becomes an issue. Can you talk to us about your experience and your challenges, Johan, when it comes to this short term? Whereas maybe in the university's time, you could get a 5-year lease with the university. Now things are changing. What does that do to you? And to anyone else, after Johan, anyone who's down there who is also a student accommodation provider, you can come and comment after Johan has done so.
For the industry, I think it's going to be excellent because it's like Palesa said, that comfort for the investors and the financiers knowing that income is there for 15 years is going to be good. But on the other hand, we've been fighting 5 years with the banks and everybody to get them to understand a 10-month lease with a student that hasn't got anything that you've got as a credit record. They've started to understand that, and we've been doing these leases across the industry, across the world. Now, we are comfortable with that. The institutions, the financing institutions are comfortable with that. So there's going to be two ways. Not everybody's going to get a 15-year lease with NSFAS. The institutions are comfortable with the 10-month leases with students. And I've learned today that the residential market is on 1-month leases. So why isn't student accommodation doing 1-month leases? It's quite a bit of a challenge there. So there's going to be two ways to do it. I think it's going to enhance the market. It's going to enhance the cash flow for new developers, especially that haven't got a track record to give comfort to the financiers to back them for the long term.
Anybody down there to respond? As long as you're not part of these companies that are here, to respond on this point? Okay. Is that a hand? All right, all right. Dean, you can come through.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add to what Johan was saying, similar to the panel this morning that spoke about affordable housing, student housing is a very similar situation whereby environment's important. Student health, mental health, etc. is very important. A 15-year lease, yes, while the student is hopefully not at university for 15 years, what a 10-month lease can do, or a 6-month lease, or a month-to-month lease, it helps the managing agent to manage the environment. You have a student that is rowdy, maybe getting drunk every night, or whatever the story might be, and disrupting the rest of the students. It's much easier to terminate that student and replace him. So I don't know how helpful it would be. As Johan alluded to, the banks are starting to warm up to the idea that actually there's going to be demand year on year, and the short-term leases actually work.
And that brings me to the next question, and I'll just drop it on the table. Anyone can pick it up. What is the difference between student accommodation investment class with the rest of those that were listening to the whole morning? Why I'm saying this, because earlier on, Honorable Letsia was challenging you to say, why do you want so much money? Whereas next door, the house, on the residential part, they are paying 6,000 for 3-bedroom, and you want 12,000 for 2-bedroom. So what makes this different? What can you say as an argument to defend yourself on that? Anybody can pick it up from the three of you.
Go for that one.
Okay.
So the question that came up earlier was, why do we have to pay 12,000 for the same place I can rent to, that you charge 9,000 for a normal tenant? I've got normal tenants. I talk to them once or twice a year when we talk about lease renewal. Guys, if I can only talk once or twice a year to a student, okay, I would also charge less. But the amount of admin and management and really going the extra mile to give them these additional opportunities and the networking and everything I spoke about before, and giving them house parents that kind of substitute that home environment, all of that comes with I want to turn the question around. I want to say, if I can give you a building with 1,000 students and each one of them are going to be employed somewhere at the end of their studies, what will you pay me for that? And that comes with accommodation, it comes with the management, it comes with the nurturing. And I would rather turn it around and say, what is that value worth? What is that worth to you?
But one can challenge you, Rita, and say it is not every single service provider doing what you are saying. So it is not every single property out there that does what you just told us earlier on. But you are all charging that high. What's the difference, Johan?
So the student life program is imperative in our developments and our property management teams as well. It has to be there. Otherwise, what are we doing? Then we're just providing a bed. Then we're not actually focusing on the student. It's a human being that we are trying to help through university, and most of these human beings don't have the means to pay for it. So you have to have everything included. You have to have your electricity, your water, your Wi-Fi, the amenities. Everything has to be included. The definition of a NSFAS student is he doesn't have 50 Rand in his pocket to top up his Wi-Fi. He doesn't have 50 Rand to top up his electricity. What happens in many of those cases is the student sits and studies by candlelight because he can't afford to top up from that point of view. So it's very important, not only on the student life, but all the other costs that you don't usually have on the other housing aspects. I've heard this morning that a lot more of that is coming into the first panel discussion that we had, the gyms that they're supplying, all of those things. So it's definitely getting there. We usually say that student housing is more like hotel management than it is residential. You have to be there daily, you have to be able to clean the kitchens, the bathrooms, the toilets. You've got none of that operating cost if it's a social housing thing. The people clean up after themselves.
Thank you on that. I hope you have successfully defended your case on that, why you should get more on this space. Maybe that also brings me to the next question of the second change is the issue of capping, the 4,500. All right? While I know that different people in the different sectors do agree that maybe 4.5 is too low, but the issue of capping is still there to say there should be capping at some point. What is your view on the PSHA with the issue of capping? Yes, let's not talk about the figure 4.5, but let's talk about capping. Do you believe in capping the models and the reason behind capping? Are they fine? Do we have to have one price nationally, or different cities are different, or such things? What's your view?
To be honest, I think it goes without saying that the government fiscus is constrained.
Yeah.
So it can never be, an ever-ending provision or, supply to meet every social or economic need.
Yeah.
However, what we want to really interrogate and engage DHET and NSFAS on is how they're communicating the cap. Because I think for me, a cap means that's the maximum that you can charge. But that education or that clarity was not well put forward. I think it allowed a lot of opportunity for some of the providers to just, change their rental rates to fit the max. Mm-hmm. So I think what's critical from where we're sitting is there needs to be, because if you're saying it's up to, how are you monitoring who's eligible? So eligibility systems, frameworks, tools need to be put in place.
Right.
Because it is very convenient to just put a cap because it's easy to just divide by X equally. But I think the homework that all as stakeholders need to do is to say, what are the tools, what are the mechanisms that we're going to put in place or we can establish and hold each other accountable on that ensures that eligibility considerations are put in place and can be effected. So if somebody, and this brings me to the issue around grading. So earlier I spoke about accreditation, and I think accreditation and grading go hand in hand.
Yes.
You cannot separate one from the other. But then, again, to the issue of the policy has set a tone of what the guidelines, what the requirements are, the specifications are to provide quality accommodation that, provides facilities that recognize the students as the human beings, the future that they are. Okay. But now, we do not see how that translates into establishing an eligibility criteria in the proposal from NSFAS.
Okay.
We need to know all of the requirements around the minimum norm standards, which ones are core, which ones are luxury, which ones, because right now we just are, as operators of provider, we must just comply with everything. Okay. But there has to be clarity and the loop has to be closed between what regulation requires, between the market needs, being the students, of what is core, what is essential versus what is luxury. And on the premise of that, we can then have a scaled funding model.
Okay.
Yeah.
To you, Dean, how does this capping issue affect you when we come through and we are submitting requests for capital funding and all that, and there's this thing of 4,500, or even if it can be 5,000, what does it do? Because if this thing becomes the issue, whereby there's capping, it's no longer about what a person can try to calculate and say, I can charge this much. He is limited to charge that much. What will that do to you as you are funding? Is that attractive? In a way, I'm trying to ask to say, what attracts you to a project to say, this project, I'm going to go for it, I'm going to fund it? With this capping, what does this do to you?
I don't think you're going to like the answer, but the truth of the matter is that when it comes to funding, especially larger student accommodation assets, the banks want the least amount of NSFAS students in those accommodations as possible, which defeats the entire object of having a NSFAS student. Again, the capital market space is very aggressive. The risk lies with the lender. If the project goes bust, the lender's out of pocket a couple $100 million. So from their perspective, they would rather take as much of that uncertainty out of the equation as possible and get private students in and forget NSFAS altogether, which again, as I mentioned, defeats the whole purpose of this thing.
What we are busy with here. Quite scary. I think towards the end now, I want to ask this question in terms of, back to you, I think, Honorable Yabo. We have observed in the past, from 2016, since this first policy came in and all that, there have been very little monitoring and call it policing to ensure that things should happen the way the policy was intended. Hence, we have got this whole spirit in terms of how it is in different universities and all that. And she just put at that point as well now to say this issue of standardization. What can we expect going forward? Again, I'm asking you in terms of what will you push to those that you are providing oversight on in terms of what we are picking up here, monitoring, because we can go there and revise this policy and still come here and then you drop it on our laps, but there is no proper structures in place to monitor and to ensure that we are moving away from best provision to student accommodation management.
I think there's a, I think there's a fine line between monitoring and policing.
Okay, Joshua.
And sometimes when people mention monitoring, they imagine policing.
Okay.
And the fine line between monitoring and policing is in that monitoring is an effective instrument applied on policy that is actively employed to ensure that all the rough edges on the policy that has been deployed, ratified, and is at work are polished off as we see it rolling out within the sector.
Sure.
Now, I want to bring forth an example of the disparities between the development of the policy, the implementation of the policy, and the various stakeholders who interact with each other in the system itself. And so recently, I think in the last 3-4 years, we had a picket by students, and I think these may have been adverts, considering the method of picketing they were using. And there they were grouped up, so as opposed to the usual picketing you find in South Africa, the revolutionary kind chanting, they do their own version. And I was interested in what they say as they are chanting. And so they say, NSFAS, NSFAS. I got bills. I got bills. And so this tells you the student on campus views NSFAS as the guy who must pay their bills because they can't afford to pay those bills. And from a policy perspective, it means you must enable NSFAS to run an efficient and effective system that is able to deliver payments on time to the student. Number one. Number two, to the provider of the roof over the student's head. But NSFAS has a responsibility from a policy perspective, not only from our perspective, to monitor that whatever they do is able to accommodate, on the one hand, the primary beneficiary of the policy, which is the student. But as well, in the value chain, it's able to speak to the various players, the accommodation owners, those who have the purpose-built, the student accommodations. They must also have a return on their investment because there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so we must find the balance. This is a social good. So let me close off my comment by saying, to us, it's a social good. And to stretch the rand means you are able to accommodate as many people in the 1.67 million registered students as possible. We are now sitting at around 1 million, 1.1 million that's going to be funded within the 47 billion that we have allocated to NSFAS. When you stretch the rand, you are able to stretch the numbers that are covered. And so you have, in closing, a Father's Day message that goes all to NSFAS. Happy Father's Day, NSFAS. You are taking care of us, you pay our bills, but it must be monitored on a day-to-day basis whether the policy is doing exactly what it's intended to do. And this is where we come in at the tail end to ask the hard questions and to wrap people over the knuckles, because now the Auditor General of South Africa is empowered to do exactly that. What people talk about all the time, consequence management.
That's good. Okay, thank you to our panelists. I'm going to give them a chance to have the last word as we are wrapping up, unless if there's a question to any one of them before I give them a chance to wrap up. You may ask your questions and then they will respond as they are wrapping up. Is there any question from the floor to any of the panel members? You were very good. They have no questions. Okay, this one.
Just interesting one. So what is your view, it's directed to me. What is your view on NSFAS not only providing money for accommodation and tuition, but going to an extent of being involved in the structuring of the education structure? Because it's one thing to just give out money and actually engage and follow up on how the students, on whether the students fully utilize that money, if that makes sense. And I'm asking this from a point of experience because as a university graduate, I could see that in some courses, yes, NSFAS would fund us, but I don't think most of the students fully utilize the money because of the education structure. So for instance, practical, like in university, there's the theory part and the practical side of things. I feel like the practical side of things is not fully incorporated, especially in construction, because I was a construction studies student as well. And I feel like it's important, the practical side of things, of how like the industry works while you're still at school is important. But I feel like it was not properly, there was not much investment into it, if that makes sense. So do you think NSFAS could go to an extent of being involved in that scenario? Or?
That question, I think, is directed to your side. You will say that in your conclusion. Any other question to someone? Yeah? All right. We are super from the floor. I'll start with you. Very brief. Our time is up.
Yes, sir.
So can you have your closing remarks from the topic that we are discussing, sustainable student accommodation?
Yes.
So what is the last shot that you want to give?
I think from a PSHA side, I think what we would like to depart with is that academic institutions, tertiary institutions are the apex of this model. They provide opportunity for all stakeholders concerned. And I think as we engage on interventions, modalities, etc., let's really build on the value that is within the student.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's
And rather
build on
that's
the
within
value
that's in
student.
the student and the university, yeah.
Okay. Rita, how would you summarize and sum up our
Well,
discussion?
maybe just a comment about the whole NSFAS centralization. Personally, I'm actually very excited about it. Last year, we got paid for the first semester, first money we've seen for the year in August. So if you can do better than that, I'll be happy. Anything will really make a difference in that space. And I think that everybody should have a student in their backyard or a property somewhere. And if you don't want to do it yourself, you know who to call.
Okay. Johan, is this the best place to be at? Or this space of investment is not the right one? What would you say?
We've got an extremely unique situation in South Africa with NSFAS that funds the amount of students that they do. Nowhere else in Africa is it happening.
Okay.
And nowhere else in Africa is the amount of capital flowing towards student accommodation than it is in South Africa.
Yeah.
So if that can be managed properly, the certainty is created for the investors that is bringing not just local capital, capital from all over the world, US dollars,
The dollars.
pounds, euros coming in
Okay.
into this industry. There is a massive shortfall, there's a massive demand. We've got a government that subsidizes it, that adds that certainty. We've got financiers in the room that have understood how a 10-month lease works with a student, and they're willing to fund these things. It's a perfect situation to be able to roll this out very well. But the uncertainty that's being created is hampering it, is holding it back. But
Very,
there's
very
an
important.
awesome opportunity in this
Very, very
industry.
important, uncertainty. That's the key word, I think, from this whole discussion. But the environment is so conducive if we can just clean out that one part. Dean, how would you wrap up this?
Just to echo what Johan was saying, the capital market space is highly competitive. I mentioned that earlier. To set student accommodation as an asset class aside next to the likes of the logistics space, the commercial, retail, energy projects the guys were mentioning in earlier discussions, there's a certain demand. There's an amount of students arriving every single year that require accommodation, and that amount of students keeps increasing. So as an asset class, it's a relatively stable investment. However, if we could sort out the uncertainties, particularly around the NSFAS side of things, I think, as Johan said, there'll be a lot more attention and money flowing towards this asset class.
Okay. I think before I give you to you, Honorable Yabo, to wrap up, I think one thing that I can take as my concluding remarks from this, I think very, very good points came through from what you are saying. And of course, I cannot talk here as deployed by NSFAS because I'm not here today sent by them, but because I do work with NSFAS on daily basis, I think this what came from here. I can be able to present that, and I do share your frustration, and I can see that really there are challenges, and if we can just clear out the issue of uncertainties, I think the backlog that you're talking about, the gap that you're talking about, can be sorted out, and whatever seems to be the misunderstandings, I think it's all about certainty. That's all I think I would like to say from what I'm picking up from this whole discussion. And of course, the funders are here, they're prepared, but that point must be cleared. We are concluding remarks, a parting shot, and then we hand over back to the program director.
We have come a long way from the initial 5,000 students that were funded when this was TEFSA, when President Nelson Mandela instructed government to establish a student funding mechanism for the poor and marginalized. And I think the former president has left a legacy. And if he were around today to see that we have moved from the initial 5,000 to funding over 1 million students now per annum, it's a monumental growth from 1996. And to think that now in 2015, the budget for NSFAS was just a meager 5 billion. Now in 2015, when the minimum norms and standards
launched,
were ratified initially, now we're sitting on 47.7 billion, 35.22% of which goes to student accommodation. We have come a long way. And to respond to the question around whether NSFAS would be well placed to do what I would term upskilling and to put money where upskilling is required, I would think there are other role players in the space who are able to provide that service. For instance, we have the National Skills Fund, who are placed squarely in the center of upskilling to ensure that those who go through your traditional universities or TVET colleges can further be upskilled in the various fields they choose to study in. So that space is already covered for. What we want to see happen as Parliament is that the rent value of the accommodation for students needs to be maximized.
Yes.
Whilst be enabling those who invest in the space to account for good ROI and yields. But there must be a center, a fulcrum where we find each other on that particular point. But I think to create sustainable spaces that are inhabitable by students is going to be a teamwork or a group work exercise. Wow. It's not just going to be government, it's going to be government and the private sector and other regulatory bodies in the space, especially NSFAS, who is the purse holder for this particular social good.
Thank you. I think our team deserves a round of applause. They've done a very, very good job. Thank you.
Thank you so much.